Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Understanding Tech Abuse Among Young People. This will be webinar number 1 in our 3-part series. For those of you who attended our September series, welcome back. My name is Caitlin Pryor. I was a staff attorney and training supervisor at Day 1 for over 3 years, and I've been working with young people for nearly 15 years. Okay, so a little bit about Day 1 and what we do. So Day 1 is the only organization in New York State that devotes all of its resources to ending dating abuse, sexual assault, and the domestic sex trafficking of young people. And we do so in what is a pretty comprehensive way. So we not only provide direct legal and social services to young people in New York City who are 24 and under and identify as a survivor of violence, but we also provide prevention workshops to children and young people on issues like consent and healthy relationships. We provide trainings like you see here today, right? Webinars and live to folks who are working with young people and want to learn more. We're also available to game plan if issues come up in your workplace and you're not really sure how to handle them. We are here to help. We invest in youth leadership development. We have our Youth Voices Network. We're going to hear from one of the Youth Voices Network members at the end of this training. Essentially, they're a group of folks who experience abuse as young people and are now activists lending their voice to this issue. We also have great materials that are geared towards children and young people that are available on our website, our Know Your Rights guides. And any and all services and materials that you're seeking, you can reach on our website, and that will be listed on the final slide in this webinar. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who have been with us before. You know that this is the deal. So this is number 1 of our 3-part series. They build off of each other. For folks who weren't able to make it today, there will be a recording that will be sent out by NOAA, so they can always listen to that recording and jump into number 2 and number 3. We ask that folks also complete feedback forms for each individual webinar. Those will be sent by NOAA as well. And if you're looking for CEUs, if you're a social worker, those will be provided after the 3rd webinar. You'll also receive the recording, like I said, after the webinar, and we're asking that folks register for each individual webinar. It will not be as a series. If you can't hear something, if I'm super loud or kind of quiet, if you can't see something, please indicate that in the chat box. All questions are going to be answered at the end of this webinar, but feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar as they come to you. And if you have any questions about any of the things I just mentioned, feel free to reach out to NOAA. NOAA is under host, and you can send them an individual message. All right, cool. So today's objectives. So like I said, we are building off of, each webinar will build off the other one. Today we're really setting some foundation. We're going to talk about why and how young people are using tech. We're going to talk about what forms of tech are they using so we can know a little bit more about that. We're going to understand how tech can be used to abuse. Our hope is that you all will leave with an increased understanding of how tech is used and used to abuse as well, but also an increased understanding of why tech is so important. So I'm going to encourage all to engage in a tech positive perspective. We are not looking for folks to get scared and go off the grid and find a cabin in the woods, okay? We are going to talk about why it is important, and each webinar will make sure to include bits of that. And we're going to finally discuss what the deep impact of tech abuse may be on a survivor, in large part because I find that when I'm working with survivors, tech abuse is an area that folks seem to think, oh, whatever, right? Just ignore it. It's not seen as serious oftentimes by service providers and by systems. So we're going to talk about how it actually is. Okay, so those are our objectives. So let's start by talking about tech and how young people use tech. It is okay if you're not that familiar with tech because we're going to talk about it, but we can rely on the young people that we're working with a lot of times to kind of help us out, right? They're going to support us through it. They're growing up with and through technology. In fact, a study from this year found that 95% of teens report that they either have a smartphone or they have access to one, right? So smartphone being beyond a text phone call phone, right? They can go on the internet, they can use apps, all of that. And about 45% of the teens said that they are online on a near constant basis. So suffice it to say, technology is a part of young people's lives, and that's why we, as service providers who are working with young people, if we really want to support them, we have to get a better sense of what's going on, and we have to be thinking about tech when we work with them. Another thing I think is important when we're thinking about tech, and we talked about this during our first set of webinars on dating abuse, but really that tech use is impacted by identity. There aren't a lot of stats out there about different identities, so whether it be ethnicity, race, religion, whether someone is documented, there's not a lot out there around that identity and their use of tech, but there are some things around LGBTQ youth and their use of tech, and I think that they're pretty telling. So it found that 81% of LGBTQ young people search for health and medical information, and that's in contrast to 46% of straight and cisgender young people. So it's almost double the rate. It found that more than 1 in 10 LGBTQ youth first disclosed their identity to someone online. So it's creating this space for community and trust and support. And that 2/3 of LGBTQ youth use the internet to connect with other LGBTQ people in the past year. Again, going to that community. And so just a reminder that that really identity impacts how young people use tech, and that they use them in some ways that are really positive. Another thing I found on identity is that income can matter sometimes. So income may matter in ways that whether that young person has a data plan, right? Or whether they're going to be using Wi-Fi that's available. And a study found also that income matters in what apps are being used. So they found that young people who are from lower income households are more likely to use Facebook than young people from higher income households. So there can be a greater variety as to what kind of tech is used, and that can be based on income as well. So going back to that identity and how it intersects with tech. And so the question of how young people use tech is really a question of how do they not use tech. And I'm sure that a lot of the ways that are listed on this slide are ways that you use technology as well. So I'm reminding you that tech has many positive ways. So young people are certainly using technology to engage in activism. We've seen that with a lot of the March for Our Lives, right? Young people using technology around gun control. They may be using technology to find out, like, why do I have this strange mark on my shoulder, right? Or to explore their identities and kind of try to feel things out, figure out their sexuality or gender identity. They may be doing it for friendship, for love. Young people form full-fledged relationships through technology, and it doesn't mean that they also meet in real life, right? They can have those relationships entirely through technology. Especially for young people who may not have access to transportation or may have to rely on parents or caretakers, it can reduce isolation, right? They may be able to maintain relationships or form relationships even if they're not able to get to that area mall or Walmart or whatever that may be. Young people are expected to use technology, right? We expect them to use it for school. They have to submit assignments through portals. You have to apply for financial assistance. So a reminder that we, in a lot of ways, are expected to use tech these days. Like if I was working and I was like, I don't feel like using email, I can only imagine what the response would be, right? We are expected to use tech, and young people are using it to kind of inform all aspects of their lives. And I think we often paint tech and young people as this negative thing, right? Like get that phone out of your face or you're glued to the phone. But a reminder that they actually may be socializing through tech, right? So it's not this isolating beast that we often talk about. And also when young people were polled as to like, hey, what do you think about tech? Is it a good thing, bad thing in your life? It was kind of a mixed bag. So they found that 31% of young people had a positive response, that they thought social media was a positive thing in their lives. And the number one response they gave was, I like connecting with friends and family. And so I'm sure other folks can identify with that as well. I know I hate a phone call, but text message I can do. And text message is probably the only way that I maintain relationships with folks. About 45% said that they were kind of indifferent, right? It wasn't positive, but it wasn't negative. So that's a big chunk of young people responding that way. And the smallest chunk, 24%, said it was a mostly negative impact of tech on them. And some of those negative results we're going to talk about, right, through this webinar series. We're not talking about fun times necessarily. We're talking about tech abuse. And so folks who experience tech abuse are in this category, folks who experience online bullying, rumor spreading. And if you think about young people and what we talked about during our first webinar series, that their brains are still developing, right? So they might press send and think about it later. You can see how there's an increased tendency to have bullying or rumor spreading happening through technology. But I do want to point out that the majority said that they either had a mostly positive or kind of ambivalent response to tech. And so we should be thinking that and holding that up when we're working with young people. Okay, so we talked about why they're using tech, right? And what they're using tech for, but what kinds of tech are they actually using? And I know that it's like constantly changing, and I'm always hearing new apps that are being used, or like aspects of apps that are being used. So I do not pretend to be like on the edge, but I've learned a lot from my clients as to what is most oftenly used. And I think it's really important that when we think about tech, we're not just thinking about Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. So those are like the social media apps that we most often think about. We have to think about the fact that most every app is designed to connect in some way, right? So I don't know if folks use Spotify, but there's a socializing aspect to it, right? Same with Venmo. So just thinking expansively when we're thinking about tech, it doesn't have to be the age-old social media, clearly used to connect with others, apps that we're thinking of when we're thinking of tech. So a study found that the most frequently used forms of tech are YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat. And I will say Snapchat, I definitely struggle with at times. They're always changing things on me. But if all else fails, if you don't know any other forms of tech, and you work with young people frequently, stick to what they're using the most, right? So learn about YouTube, learn about Instagram, learn about Snapchat. And just a reminder what we talked about before, how identity can impact. Facebook, right, is more likely when we're working with lower income young people. So these are really the social media platforms that are most often being used and that we should be thinking and asking about. And so there's really a range of social media that you'll see on here. So you'll see I listed Facebook, right? I have text on here. I have Snapchat, Instagram, but I also want you to think of the giants, right? Apple. And all that Apple encompasses, right? So Apple has my email, maybe. Apple has my iTunes. Apple controls my iPhone. Think about the behemoth Google, right? So Google not only has my calendar, but it has a text messaging phone app. It has my email, and it has my documents, right? So we need to be thinking expansively about some of these kind of behemoths that control a lot of our tech. Also be thinking about video games, right? Studies have shown that cross genders, young people are using video games and using them regularly. And video games have chat aspects, they have webcam aspects. You can compete with others online, right? So that's a way that young people are socializing. So like Xbox and PlayStation. Also be thinking about transportation apps. And so like Uber, Lyft, those can be ways that you're sharing information. I know folks who share Lyft accounts, right? And so they're sharing where they started, where they ended. It might be sent to their email. So if you have access to someone's email, then you're able to see their Lyft, right? So we're thinking pretty expansively when we're thinking about what forms of tech are used. And we're not forgetting about dating apps. Dating apps are on the rise. Dating apps are being used a lot by young people. And so when we're thinking about what tech is used, we should be thinking about dating apps. I don't expect you to know all the dating apps. There are like a bazillion more than what is up here. But just be familiar that young people are using dating apps. They're using them a lot. what dating app they use may depend on their gender identity or sexual orientation. And so that's something to be kind of figured out. But young people are using dating apps for a number of reasons. And really, the reasons are largely, well, in part, one, larger community, right? You might have this small pool of people that you're able to meet in school. But if you go on a dating app, then you have this larger community, right? Some folks find that on a dating app, they can be more authentic. They can kind of do this initial screening up front in a way that feels safer, right? Through phone calls, through text messages, maybe through video chat before meeting in person. It also removes heteronormative assumptions. And so by that, I mean, on dating apps, you typically say what gender identity you identify as, and also who are you attracted to, right? Whereas if you're in real life, you have to kind of figure out that, and there's chances for rejection on every front, right? There's chance for rejection if they're not attracted to the gender that you identify with, right? And then there's the chance for rejection if they don't like you. So this removes that first layer of like, hey, who are you attracted to? And lets you just get to, do you like me? Like, do we have this connection? And so it can be really helpful, particularly for LGBTQ young people who are trying to navigate that. It can kind of take away a little bit of the vulnerability, which is pretty important when you're a young person and dating, because dating is hard. Fewer unknowns, that can go back to that. And you really can slow down that pace if you want to. So you could spend months forming this relationship. And again, I want to remind you, young people may date entirely online, right? So do not assume that the dating is in person. The dating could be entirely through technology, and that doesn't in any way change that relationship for that young person. Okay, so moving along, let's think about what information do we actually share through technology. And when I'm thinking about technology, I want you to think expansively. So I want you to think again of the behemoths like Google and Apple, of Lyft, of Instagram, of maybe your school portal, right? And what information are you sharing in all these areas of technology? And so really, like everything, right? So if I'm thinking of a behemoth like Apple, I have my notes section. And so my notes section, I could be keeping my passwords because, like, let's be honest, right? That's where most people keep their passwords or write it down somewhere. We're going to be talking about tech safety, but I also am very realistic that like ease of access is mega important. So if you can access my Apple, you might be able to access my notes and access my passwords that I've listed there, right? We also share what we do and when we do it, right? So if I'm posting a picture on Instagram at this time and date every week, then you can kind of get a sense of my routine, right? Or a sense of who my friends are, or a sense of who my family is and where I'm from. Folks post fears and dreams. They might email that to themselves. They might write it in their notes section. They might have a blog. They might write it on Instagram. And so that can be shared. We might share where we live, where we go to school. We might share what clubs we're in, right? How old we are. You might find that on technology, you're sharing things that you wouldn't share if you were in person, right? So you might be sharing information about your gender identity or your sexual orientation that you may not be ready to share with others in person. You might be sharing that you're undocumented, or there might be information about your health or HIV status, right? So we have a lot of information that is held in technology and shared through technology. We also share our location. And we'll talk about this a lot during the second webinar, but we share our location in a lot of ways where we intend to and a lot of ways where we don't intend to, right? So we might share it through a picture that shows me in Central Park, and so you just kind of through deductive reasoning, be like, oh, that looks like Central Park. She must be there. But we also share it through like having location attached to our pictures and posting them. So we'll talk about that during the second webinar, but you know, we're doing sometimes without thinking, we're sharing a location. And like all of you, I mean, I have banking apps, right? I have health apps. And so access to these apps means sharing that information. So, as you can imagine, talking about all the ways that we use tech and what we share through tech, that could be very much used to abuse. As we move into this section and as we move through this webinar, I really, really want to encourage folks not to err on the side of fear, to feel like abuse is happening always, or to feel the need to just shut off all technology or go offline. Tech, as we talked about already, has many very positive aspects. In the second and third webinars, we're going to talk about ways that tech provides so much safety to us. So I want you all to keep that in mind as we move into talking about how tech is used to abuse, because it's very easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole and be like, I'm getting a landline and going off the grid and not sharing anything. And that's really not going to work too well in this day and age, but also it's not necessary. Also, you could be making yourself less safe if you don't use technology. So let's move into talking a little bit about how tech is used to abuse. And so I think it's again important to think of identity when you're thinking of tech. As we talked about during the first webinar series, how you experience abuse can be based on your identity, right? Whether you seek out us can be based on identity. Whether systems believe you will be impacted by identity. And so it's something to really think about when you're evaluating for tech abuse. One example I think is important is maybe you're working with a young person and they say that their partner posted a picture of them kissing online. To you, that could seem very innocuous, but to them, it could be outing, right? So we're thinking about how identity actually plays into tech abuse and can be kind of used against them through tech. So the stats show us that young people, as you know, no surprise given that young people are most likely to experience dating abuse, young people are very likely to experience tech abuse. And so 50% of young people 14 to 24 experience some form of digitally abusive behavior. They did not parse out romantic relationships versus friendships. So this is not an exact number. There's not a lot out there. But it's still a high number to know how many folks are experiencing negative behaviors online. 27% of LGBTQ reported not feeling safe online. However, we're keeping in mind, right, all the ways that they use tech for safety and positive support. And a study showed that 17% of LGBT folks have been threatened or victimized by non-consensual pornography. So the sharing of sexual pictures or images, which we're going to talk about in greater detail a little bit today, but largely during our third webinar. And that's versus 2% of folks who did not identify as LGBT. They did not look into whether the rates at which trans and gender nonconforming folks experience non-consensual pornography. So that's why it's only LGBT folks. But you can see that the numbers are quite stark, right? 17% versus 2%. So identity matters as to how you experience abuse and whether you're speaking to us about abuse. And when we're thinking about abuse, if you're not too familiar with what dating abuse is, how you would identify it, I really encourage you to watch the webinars from the prior series that was on just basically foundational dating abuse among young people to kind of get a better sense of that. Because we're really just using that knowledge of dating abuse and what does dating abuse look like, and we're applying tech to it, right? It's not more complicated. We see tech as another tool in the toolbox, really. And so really it's when that partner is using technology to engage in that pattern of power and control. The one person's world is getting smaller, right? The harm doer is the one cut. And the harm doer may use technology to do anything from threatening someone, right, to isolating them, cutting off their community. They may be coercing them into behaviors. They could be embarrassing them. They could be stalking them. And essentially, when we think of tech abuse, all forms of dating abuse can take place through tech. Isn't that fun? So by that, I mean, someone can engage in sexual abuse that's tech-based, right? So if we think about the sharing of sexual pictures or images without consent, that's both sexual abuse and it's tech abuse. You may find that it's financial abuse if someone accessed someone's bank app, right? And transferred funds or drained funds. That's the intersection of financial abuse and tech abuse, right? So unfortunately, all forms of abuse that we talked about during that first webinar last time can take place through technology. And tech could be the sole form of abuse, although I find that tech is the sole form of abuse really only in relationships that are based solely in tech, or it can be part of a larger pattern. And I can tell you that I have never had a dating abuse case where there wasn't tech involved in working with young people. So if you're working with someone and you've identified that there is dating abuse present, screening for tech is so important, and is likely going to turn up if you're working with a young person. And I'm really asking that folks think of tech abuse as really age-old tactics of abuse just through technology. So most are simple. Most are not going to be complex. Most are not going to be this like monster bug that takes over your whole computer, can see everything. Most are going to be berating someone through text message or calling and yelling at someone. Most are going to be incessant text messages or phone calls or direct messages, right? They're not going to be the more complex forms. And those are the forms I think kind of boggle people and be like, I'm in over my head. No, most forms are going to be the forms that you're familiar with, just happening through tech. And so I want folks to take a moment and think about what are some examples of tech abuse that come to mind. A reminder, we're not thinking about online bullying. We're thinking about tech abuse within a romantic relationship. And if you would put them into your chat box, write some examples of tech abuse that come to mind when I bring up this topic, or we're thinking about dating abuse and how tech can be an instrument of abuse. So if you'll share that in the chat box, that will be wonderful. I'll give you a moment or two to text some things. To see if anyone has any ideas for examples of tech abuse. So I have inappropriate pics. And so that could be something like an embarrassing pic, right? Like something that you're like, why did you share that? Or it could be sexual. Asking to show location, right? And so a lot of times we're finding that asking to show location may be that you're video chatting with someone and required to show, like you said, you're going to your mom's, like show me you're with your mom, right? Stalking, right? So sometimes stalking can come through accessing someone's app and seeing like, oh, you sent this direct message to Lindsay saying you're meeting here, right? So finding them through that, or seeing an email, tracking someone's phone, yep. And so that can be done a range of different ways. It could be something like Find My Friends, right, where you willingly share each other's locations. It can be something more sinister like spyware, forced FaceTime, right? So that goes back to what I was saying before, asking to show location. Constant texting, messaging, contact, yes. And I think that a lot of times the constant messaging and contact is something that's kind of brushed over, but something that can really take over someone's life. I've had clients where they are expected, no matter the time of day or what they are doing, to respond to a text, to a phone call, to a video chat. If they don't, then, it's going to hit the fan. And so I've had clients who have not had a full night's sleep because of that expectation that they be responding to anything that comes their way. Because a lot of times it goes along with extreme jealousy, right? Who are you hanging out with then? What are you doing that you can't be with me? This idea that time is only for the harm doer and not for the survivor to use. So folks listed a bunch of the different forms that we have on this overwhelming page. So the stalking, forcing the video chat, the non-consensual pornography, so that's the sharing of sexual pictures or videos without a survivor's consent. We'll talk about that in a second. I've had clients where their partner will tag them on something, so tag them on Instagram, tag them on Facebook, and it could be something super cryptic. So one thing that I struggle with at times is that something that means something to my client might mean nothing to me and may mean nothing to, say, a police officer or the courts, right? but they know it's a threat. So they could tag them in something that seems pretty innocuous that is actually not, is actually a threat. They can turn on their GPS tracking, so like just accessing someone's phone, turning on their location settings, or having duplicate apps. So I've had clients where their partner has the same app as them, signed in as them on their phone. So if their location settings are set on, then they can see where they're at. Also, Snapchat recently allowed you to show location as well. You have to, the default is off, so you don't share your location, but you can share your location with folks through Snapchat as well. It could be that third parties are involved. So I had a client whose partner, so this is the same client whose partner expected them to pick up the phone no matter the time. They also, when they were not getting along, to kind of like force them out, force them to talk to them, they were posting their sexual picture on Facebook, on blog sites, and on porn sites. And on Facebook, they also posted my client's phone number. And so third parties were actually reaching out to my client asking for sexual contact because that's what the partner had posted on the Facebook. And so we spent a lot of time trying to get that down. You'll also find that I had a client whose picture was posted on Instagram, and so the comment section, right? So that's kind of like the third party engagement that can often happen. It can also happen that a partner reaches out to third parties through tech. So a partner may message maybe the father of one of my clients and bother them. I've actually had a partner where I had a client where they contacted their father to kind of disparage them and say what a terrible person they were. And so you can imagine how sometimes that may ruin relationships. I've had clients, so you see listed here, disable device remotely, and when do not pick up call, use Find My Phone. So I had a client who was refusing to answer their partner's phone calls. And they had access to their Apple, right? So this behemoth. And so when they wouldn't answer the phone calls, the partner then used the Find My iPhone that's in the Apple app where you have that really annoying ding that you can do incessantly. And so they did that. And when my client didn't respond to that, they disabled their phone. And they were able to do so simply because they had access to their Apple account, right? So if you think of it in the way it was created, the idea was so that when my phone is stuck between couch cushions, I can find it, right? So I'm doing that being Find My iPhone. And then if I find it's not between the cushions, and actually I probably dropped it on the street somewhere, I'm able to disable the device remotely, right? So just shut it down. So those are the benign reasons for these actions, but they can also be used by a harm doer clearly to just kind of take it out, right? When they're not being heard, they're going to be heard another way. I've had a lot of clients where they're forced to unfriend people, right? Their partner will go through their accounts and force them to unfollow or unfriend people. They're required to provide their passwords for everything, and their partner will check in on those accounts. Also, sometimes passwords can be guessed, right? How many folks out there use like their first pet's name as their password? Or something that's going to be relayed during the course of a relationship, right? We relay personal details. There's really easy steps for turning on someone's webcam. So you could be doing that and watching someone. Sometimes folks share that someone's undocumented, right? As a way to kind of coerce them back into the fold. And just this idea that no matter what or where you are, you're expected to respond. Sometimes I've had people test my clients to pretend to be another, maybe like a friend, and see if they have a romantic interest in them, right? So pretending to be someone else. So these are a lot of the ways, and as we go through the webinar series, I'm sure a lot more examples, unfortunately, will come to me as to ways that tech can be used to abuse. I want to quickly define 3 of these, and these are 3 things that we're going to talk about in depth during our 3rd webinar. but I want to make sure that folks are all on the same page. So we're going to talk briefly about what is spyware, what is spoofing, and non-consensual pornography before we move into talking a little bit about the impact of tech abuse and hearing from a survivor. So spoofing. I don't know if folks have heard of this before. Essentially, spoofing is whenever you're impersonating someone else. So some examples of that may be using a spoofing app to call a survivor's phone, and maybe you change your voice to sound feminine, and you say that you are the survivor's mom, and you ask the survivor to meet you in the park. And so you get to the park, and actually the partner's there, right? So impersonating mom to try to have contact with the survivor. It could be there are spoofing apps that let you do spoofing text messages, pretending to be someone else. And the spoofing call I just talked about, it could actually come up as mom's phone number, and then it could sound like mom because of the voice change. And so you could be not thinking anything of it until you see the partner in the park. You can also spoof people. I have a lot of times where partners will set up fake accounts for my clients. So set up a fake Instagram as my client, right? And so they might have embarrassing pictures on there. They might harass friends and family on there, trying to isolate them. I'll also find that they'll pretend to be my client and send an email, maybe to a professor. So spoofing is whenever you're impersonating someone else. And the usual intentions are either to like gain FaceTime, right? So like you pick up the call. If you've been ignoring that person, you actually pick up the call because you think it's your friend. So you no longer are being like frozen out. It can be to sabotage. It could be pretending to be like the lawyer and saying the court case is canceled. Don't go to court tomorrow, right? And the case is dismissed. It can be to isolate. So you can imagine setting up those fake accounts and harassing friends and family. You're not going to have a lot of friends and family left unless you're really upfront with what's going on. Or it can be to find out information. So it can be a way of stalking someone if you share information through a text message, through an email, through a direct message, through a phone call, thinking it's someone else that you trust and you would share that information with. And so we're going to circle back to spoofing and how do we figure out if it's spoofing and how do we prove that it's spoofing and how do we safety plan during the third webinar. The second thing I want to define is spyware. So this is an area I do not want folks to think spyware is everywhere. This is an area that's super creepy. Spyware is typically an app that is downloaded to a device, so typically a phone or a computer, that once it's on there, you can see everything. It's essentially running on the survivor's device and the harm doer's device. So with that, they're able to see email sent. They're able to hear phone calls made. They're able to read text messages. They're able to actually see where they are, like turn on GPS, and even set up a thing where when they enter this area, they get a notification. For phones, you typically have to have physical access. So you need to have the phone in your hand and download the app. And so that's why something that we'll talk about during our second webinar is that's a really important screening question if we're afraid of spyware. For computers, you can do it remotely. So that's when you get that like cute kitty picture and it turns out to be like spyware or malware, right? And so that's the way it usually happens through computers. Once it's on there, it's pretty difficult to detect and remove, particularly as someone who's not a computer expert, and it can reinstall. So if there is spyware, it's going to be important that you're getting someone who is an expert in the field. And that you're safety planning. But like I said, this is not that frequent. I will say that in working with young people, I don't see spyware. I think in large part because you have to purchase it. It's not cheap. It's like $80 and up, but it can be prohibitive. If they are dating someone who's older, has means, or is a computer expert, spyware is something you want to think about a little bit more. The third area that I just want to quickly define so that we're all on the same page as we're moving through these webinars is non-consensual pornography. And so these are sexual videos or pictures that are shared without your consent or knowledge. And when we're thinking about non-consensual pornography, it's not always that picture that was taken surreptitiously, right, from like without the survivor knowing. It may be a sex that was shared during the course of a relationship, right, out of trust, perhaps out of coercion. So they may have shared it willingly and knowingly, but that doesn't mean that they consented for it to be shared. And so oftentimes it may be posted on social media, it may be on websites, it may be distributed. You'll hear it oftentimes called revenge porn. But we tend to stay away from that. It invokes a whole other, it's kind of a sensationalist name for it. So this is something to be aware of because it's happening on a lot of my cases, unfortunately. And so during that third webinar, we're going to talk through like, what do we do about this? Because this can be some of the most isolating, humiliating forms of tech abuse that I see. Okay, so let's talk about how tech impacts survivors, and let's hear from a survivor. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in that chat box so we can answer them during the final part of today's webinar. Okay, so I want you to look at this jumble of weird contents of my purse. That'd be a big purse. And think for a second, what is this, right? What does this represent? Where do you find these things? How does this intersect with tech abuse? Why would I be showing you this? So back in the day, before the smartphone, you would have to go to your written journal, right? Or maybe write it on the computer if you wanted to journal. Then you would go to maybe your photo album or your camera if you're looking for pictures, right? Your letters may be in a separate location, your calendar in a separate location, your book with all your names and contacts in a different location, right? All of those would be in different location. However, as has been pointed out in the chat box, these are now items that you can all find in your phone, right? So access to your phone means access to so many aspects of yourself that perhaps you weren't really thinking of when you provided them the password to your phone, thinking they would only use it to look at this, right? Or didn't think that like your Apple was connected to your Gmail. And so we use this picture to really display how invasive and pervasive tech abuse can be, right? It is accessing someone's innermost thoughts, their journal. It's accessing their list of contacts, who they know and how to contact them, right? It could be accessing their memories and their pictures. And so to really be thoughtful when we're working with a young person and dealing with tech abuse, that we're not flippant about it. Because it really can be down the rabbit hole. And so often these days we have accounts connected to accounts because it's easier, right? Why do I have to remember the password for my Instagram if I can just sign in through my email? And so access to one thing can be access to another. And it's just important to remember how much information someone may be able to see if they're engaging in tech abuse. Because we know that the impact is great, right? We talked about impact during the first webinar series, but you can imagine how the forms I just spoke of tech abuse could ruin relationships, right? With friends and family, could remove your community. If you don't feel safe going online, maybe you're no longer seeking out those friends that you formed online and that support that you were able to gain online. We heard how third-party participation can happen, and with that, hate crimes and things of that nature can come as well. Sometimes information is shared where you lose your housing, you lose your job, you maybe lose access to school, right? There are health implications. It can leave you feeling like you can't go anywhere, that you can't speak to anyone, and that person is everywhere, and really start to question yourself and whether your sense of self and reality is on point. And I know working with clients, a lot of times I'm finding that they just never feel like they're safe. They feel like that person could be anywhere and could know anything, like the whole big brother, right? And so the impact is great. And so let's hear from a Youth Voices Network member who is going to speak a little bit to her experience of tech abuse and to the impact of that tech abuse. And then afterwards, we'll wrap up and leave with some instructions for next time. Okay.
My stories around technology abuse are a little bit different than others, but I still think they are important for people to hear about. My tech abuse came towards the end of the relationship. So when things had gotten more intense and more heated, um, I was sitting in my dorm room after I had left and just hanging out with my friends. And I had ended up living with a random high school girl who I was kind of friends with in high school, but we ended up at the same college. We both ended up with no roommates. We were like, let's live together. And so we're sitting there, we're just talking, and I get a phone call from one of my girlfriends from freshman year. And she's like, where are you right now? And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm just sitting in my dorm room. And she's like, you're in your dorm room? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, are you on your computer? And I was like, no. And she was like, you need to go on your Facebook right now. And she's like, you need to look at your status. And I was like, what are you talking about? And so I opened up my computer and went on my status, and there was like paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of like very personal information that about my life. So like about my addiction that runs in my family, about like my sex life, about like people in high school that maybe I had ever talked badly about, like about my family, like all these things were just in paragraphs on my Facebook. And I was like, what the hell? Like where did this come from? And obviously I was so lucky that she saw it within like 2 minutes of it going up. I obviously deleted it immediately and then sat there to think about it. And I was like, he's the only person who would know all this information. Like, he's the only one that would know what was written on there. And so obviously I changed my password and I texted him and I was like, did you just hack into my Facebook and write all these things? And his response basically was like, the world deserves to see you for who you really are, kind of, because I guess he was still angry. And I remember sitting there with Sarah, my roommate, and Danielle at this point had come downstairs because she was my friend. And I was like, how long has he had my password? I had never told him my password. I had never shared it with him. I had never told him what it was. I had never, like, done anything. Like, and in my password for Facebook, I think it was like the same password as my Gmail. Like, I don't remember, but I remember sitting there being like, he must have been hacking into my Facebook, and it was my Twitter. That's what it was, Facebook and Twitter. I was like, he must have been breaking into my Facebook and Twitter for God knows how long during this relationship because my password is basically the same. And he must have just watched me put it in one day, and I had not realized, and he had been doing this. And then I went back and looked through like months, and there was like messages from my friends that I had never seen that had said like reviewed or seen or whatever. There was like comments on things that I had not made. I had deleted friend requests that I never saw. And then I think the one thing I was the most sad about that he did, and he must have done it at the same time as when he wrote the status. I had obviously, like I said, like I had lost a lot of my high school friends, and I had at the time during freshman year, like obviously we all kind of drifted, but I had been using social media as like my way of connecting with them at least to some extent. And we had like so many pictures from like high school graduation and prom weekends and like junior year, and senior year is like really fun when you're in high school. Like I was a cheerleader, football games, like everything and all these things. He deleted every single picture that I had on Facebook before that day. So even today, if you go onto my Facebook, my pictures start my second week of sophomore year with my sophomore year, like with my college friends and on. Like they're the only pictures I have of high school are people that I'm tagged in. So like, pictures are what you have these days. Like social media and the images that you have to look back on is like what you use. And so I think he was like mad about like where it came from and my high school friends and this and that and like my freshman year that he like deleted all the photos. It was weird because it happened at the end, but I think the tech abuse must have been going on throughout the whole time, and he must have been using what he was seeing on my social media to manipulate me throughout the relationship. I just didn't know it was happening, if that makes sense. That was one of the big ones that I remember being like kind of scared that a man could access that type of personal information about me, and I just didn't know. And I wish I had known.
Okay. Um, so we heard from a survivor. First, the form of tech abuse was that her partner was accessing her Facebook and she had no idea, and believed this was actually going on for an extended period of time. And I think it's really important to point out that how he gained access to her Facebook sounds like it was super low tech. So simply watching, right? Simply watching her type it in. He didn't need to hack. He didn't need to guess. It seems like it was simply that. And they were in relationships, so you're not really thinking twice of it when it's happening. And so the impact we really see being outlined is the impact of first that initial post, right? So sharing all this personal information, and how often do we complain to our partner about people in our life with the thought that that's not going to be shared, right? And so sharing all that information on her Facebook page, you can imagine how that could impact relationships with friends and family. Even if they understand that it was, harmful and hateful for him to post it, they may not understand that that information was shared or conveyed to him in the first place, right? So you can see how that would isolate, how that might ruin relationships. You also see the impact is kind of this like incredulous, like, how could I not have noticed? And she kind of sounds like she's questioning everything. Like, how many times were things said to me having gained that information from being in my account without my knowledge in a way that manipulates me? And so kind of like circling back and thinking over everything that happened before. And the things he did before, it seems like the most impactful was the deleting of pictures, right? So having that access to that photo album, and just deleting a portion of her life where she was maybe only saving those pictures to Facebook. And then you can see how it might have impacted her experience in college, how she wasn't getting messages from friends, she wasn't getting friend requests, there were comments being made as if they were her. And so I would say that's a form of spoofing too, right? So if he's commenting as her Facebook page, he's pretending to be her, so he's impersonating her. And so you really just see her kind of like thinking back and trying to connect the dots, as to how that affects. And she's in college, but it's still impacting, relationships with folks that she may have left at home. And so we're going to hear more from her throughout the webinar series. But I think this is a great example of, one, how tech can be used to abuse, and two, the impact of that tech. And we will talk a little bit about, she changed her password. So during our second webinar, we're going to talk about safety planning and talk about, for some, changing passwords is the way to go, and for others that can escalate. So to be thinking of alternatives, and other ways to be trying to protect ourselves when we think there may be tech going on. Okay, so let's move into some takeaways, and then if any folks have questions, we will go from there. So a reminder as we sum up that we are engaging in tech positivity, right? We are not pushing people to go offline. We are not pushing people to just shut down their Facebook, Instagram, change their number, block folks. We are engaging in a tech positive approach, and we're going to talk more about that during our next two webinars. We're going to remember how deeply impactful tech abuse can be. You saw that the ripple effect, especially tech abuse, can have. By just one account, you're able to access all these folks in your life. Back in the day, you might have to do like a letter writing campaign and send it to all friends and family. But now you can post something online for all to see. And so that deep impact is important as we're working with young people and as we are advocating for them in systems. We are thinking expansively when we're thinking about what kinds of tech young people are using, how that tech might be used to abuse, and how it can also be used for safety and the positive end of things. And we're reminding ourselves that most forms of tech abuse are going to be simple, right? Most forms of tech abuse are not going to be spyware. They are going to be the incessant calls, the incessant text messages, or even what we just heard from the YBN member, right? The more simple forms of tech abuse that he was able to just look over her shoulder and see her password. He didn't have to use increased technology for that. And before we break, I just want to share a brief story just around tech positive and not pushing people to go off the grid. I was working with that young person that I spoke of before, whose partner posted her number on Facebook, encouraging others to contact her for sexual activity and her sexual pictures. And so that client reached out to law enforcement, reached out to district attorney, and really heard nothing. And so I went with them for a meeting with the district attorney one time, and the partner had been incessantly calling and texting the client. And the district attorney said, well, why don't you change your number? And my client had this really awesome response that you really shouldn't have to have, because it's your number and it's hard as anything to change your number and have to update all that. She had the answer of, well, my grandmother has Alzheimer's and she only remembers my number. So it's the only way she's able to call me when she needs me. You really shouldn't need an answer like that to be like, no, I'm not changing my number. Right? So we are going to really strategize in the next two webinars how we can support survivors to not have to change their number, to instead think of ways to increase their safety and use tech for safety.